Joining us here in Doha is Zeidon Alkinani. He's founding director of the Arab Perspectives Institute. Very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. Let's talk about, once again, the dynamic between Israel and the Trump administration particularly. Donald Trump there is saying that Israel is not going to be attacking Iran's oil and gas facilities anymore. Is he actually in a position to be able to control what Israel is doing, given the fact that both sides have admitted this was something that Israel did by itself?
Well, since the beginning of the war, we did notice there were strong divergences and differences. One objective, perhaps, that Trump and Netanyahu might share is limiting or preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon. However, with Israel, the focus is much more beyond that. They're much more interested in ensuring that the ballistic missile operations would also be prevented, given that it is targeting Israel. It wouldn't target the United States. Although strategic allies in the region would have hoped for the U.S. to be much more considerate towards the ballistic missiles and other elements to prevent the attacks on the U.S. bases, but also the attacks on the civilian infrastructures in the GCC. Overarching, we're noticing that Trump, in the lead up to the war entering its third week, may have been open to the idea of regime change and no longer the idea and the rationale or the concept of a complete surrender, as his rhetoric was apparent in the early days of the war, which indicates that Trump may want the war to finish a bit sooner than Netanyahu, given that he has to deal with the midterm elections in October and November. He's also facing a really strong domestic critique and disagreement across the spectrum, not just for the Democrats, but also the Republican congressmen. With Netanyahu, it's a much more long-term existential pathway, trying to use this as an opportunity to retaliate against the existential threat that was presented to Israel post-October 7, which is why we're noticing other fronts are also being led by Netanyahu in the war or the attacks against Lebanon's Hezbollah. Post this war, they will be facing very different challenges. Netanyahu will be questioning whether he has been able to get symbolic achievements that he can sell back to the Israeli public opinion, whereas the United States will be facing a lot of questions and assessments, whether it is the reliable strategic ally to some of these GCC states. Is it also a reliable ally in the eyes of the European Union, who are facing severe consequences from the global economic crisis, as we're witnessing what's happening to the prices of the gas and the oil prices and what's happening to the different currency devaluations across the world? So these different objectives are expected, given that the consequences would also be different along the way.
One of the specialities you have is to break down the kind of political maneuvering that we have seen and the way that politicians and lawmakers deal with situations like this, particularly related to the Gulf. Donald Trump has said that he did not know about Israel's plans to attack the South Pars gas field. In your assessment, do you think he genuinely was not informed, or is this a strategic avoidance of knowledge dependent on the outcome?
It's hard to predict what the actual truth would be behind the scenes, but in both cases, that's bad news to the GCC allies for the various reasons. One is that whether the US knew about it or Trump knew about it or not, that means they were not being ethical and integral to their partners that they were claiming to trying to prevent this war to escalate to their borders. And if they were not aware of it, then that means Trump has accepted to rationalize and legitimize a war with Israel in the region against Iran, with the direct consequences that means to the GCC states, without having enough power and enough influence and enough responsibility to ensure that he has an entire full picture in ensuring what's happening around the area.
I want to ask you about the relationship with the GCC countries that they must be at least reassessing with regard to the United States. It has been an assumption by those of us who watch the region that one of the reasons why the GCC countries were prepared to have an American presence in their countries was to protect them, at least in part, from any threat that may have come historically from Israel. Given the circumstances you're just describing, what do you think is likely to be the way that the GCC countries are viewing that potential threat and perhaps Israel's ambitions towards the Gulf?
Well, everything that was conducted throughout this war and the way the US and Israel unilaterally made a decision to conduct this war against Iran, knowing the consequences it would mean to the GCC states has not only left the US role in the region questioned by the GCC, but also by its European and Western allies. One thing that seems to be very narrowed down in the Trump administration is its militarized viewpoint in these relationships across the region. The GCC is not only has established decades-long strategic military relationships or partnerships with the US. It's also based on educational enterprises, businesses, economics, environment, commercial relationships. Does the Trump administration think that going into this war with Israel against Iran and allowing the reflected in the overarching consequences in the region, is it enough and worth putting the US relationship in this part of the world at risk in the future? Does it have the economic backup to ensure the consequences of such a fragile and breaking relationship to cover up for it? These are some of the very alarming questions that will arise. It has already erupted across the different political discourses and rhetoric across the GCC. Obviously, fundamental changes couldn't happen overnight, given that this relationship has been built for many years. But fundamental changes and serious efforts and commitment in trying to find ways to be much more autonomous and not rely on US geopolitical actions that did not consult their allies in the region.
Really appreciate you breaking that down for us. Zeidon Alkinani, thank you very much.
Zeidon Alkinani, founding director of Arab Perspectives Institute. Good to see you, Zeidon. So we are still analysing the fallout, before we talk about the possibility of ground troops being deployed there, the fallout of Israel's attack on Iran's South Pars gas field that prompted a retaliatory strike by the Iranians against Qatar's Ras Laffan gas field. The costs of that are only now starting to be crunched. 17% of Qatar's total LNG export capacity has been wiped out. Annual losses of $20 billion a year. This is catastrophic in many ways. But what does that all say, do you think, about the power dynamic between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, given that Donald Trump has said now Israel will not do that again?
Well, the power dynamics and the divergences since the beginning of the war were very evident, as we discussed in previous discussions. Trump has a very different objective, perhaps, towards a minor regime change in Iran that would be much more aligned with Washington's objectives in the region, whereas Israel would rather use this as an opportunity to dismantle the state institutions in Iran as an aggressive reaction from the momentum post-October 7, but also ensure a regional chaos, which is why a part of its overarching objective is to attack and target infrastructures in Iran, which they would know in return would come with a retaliation response from Iran towards the GCC rather than to Israel. This isn't only a direct threat to the regional economy or the infrastructure or the national security of this region. It's a direct threat to the global economy. As we witnessed, it's been evident that the global economic crisis is across the globe, across the spectrum, is being significantly impacted by this conflict, given the huge reliance that the world has on the Strait of Hormuz, the LNG coming out of Qatar, and many of the other energy infrastructures in the region. Whether it's Trump's inability to be much more aligned with Netanyahu's objectives, or Trump's inability to minimize or prevent the large-scale impact economically and politically from the war to the region, and how this translates into a wider economic crisis, is an alarming flag. It's a huge alarming signal even to the European allies who are facing a severe economic crisis from this war.
And what's worried, I think, diplomats in the region and beyond is also this back and forth as to how much the Americans may have known about Israel's intention to strike the South Pars gas field in Iran, knowing that the response would be huge. The Israelis, Benjamin Netanyahu, have come out now saying, we did it all alone. The Americans, Donald Trump, on his Truth Social post yesterday, suggesting that they didn't know anything about it, that the Israelis lashed out, as the words that are being used. But we have multiple Israeli sources, Reuters, the Associated Press, citing intelligence officials that this is not true, that US senior command may have had some degree of knowledge about this. And that doesn't particularly bode well when it comes to other threats to infrastructure in the area. I'm talking specifically about the Bushehr nuclear plant, where on March the 17th, the Israelis hit an auxiliary building only 350 metres away from a nuclear reactor.
Well, the US, or the Trump administration, and more precisely, is perhaps also realizing that the long-term objectives or the post-war implications of this war might leave the US in a much more mistrusted position as a strategic ally to these Gulf states. It feels like there's a direct and an indirect intentions from both sides. Now, as we notice that this conflict definitely indicates and highlights strong and significant geopolitical disagreements in the region, if we were to look at the differences between Iran and Israel and the different objectives that would clash as the US comes into
So
the
talking
picture.
about those clashing objectives, we did mention, of course, the possibility of ground troops. Benjamin Netanyahu seems to be that is the direction of travel as far as he is concerned. Is that something the US really shares right now?
Yeah, well, of course, Netanyahu doesn't mind sharing such suggestions. He is not the one who will be faced with criticism and questioning from the Congress. As for the US, Trump perhaps has 60 days, constitutionally speaking, to propose such a military action without a US legislative approval and support to do such a thing. But economically speaking, statistically speaking, the numbers does not seem to align with such an objectives. The war is very costly. The US has already, or the Pentagon has already requested an additional $200 billion to continue whatever additional requirements is needed for this war to meet their objectives. And even if we were to speak about the objectives, they're very different between Israel and the US, as we're noticing. They might align on many of the aspects, but they also differ on many of the aspects. With Israel, it's a much more existential war. With the US, it's a much more war to defend whatever remains of the US influence in the region.
Very briefly, Zeidon, is it in Israel's strategic interest to draw the United States and indeed the Gulf countries deeper and deeper into a conflict in Iran? What would be the strategic reason for that?
That has been the strategic way from the very beginning of the war, by pushing the US to take the lead at the front seat of this war, to give it an international legitimacy, but in parallel to that and simultaneously trying to push the GCC in the middle of this conflict, while Israel can continue its very different regional fronts for its own expansionist agendas. As we noticed, it has significantly and severely opened a much bigger front in Lebanon, while it claims that it is focusing on Iran.
Okay. Zeidon Alkinani, pleasure having you here. Many thanks.
Of course, the Israeli attack that was carried out on the South Pars field that Iran has, the subsequent response that we've seen from Iran on that. Is Donald Trump, in your estimation, actually in a position to be able to control what Israel is doing in this conflict?
Not completely, absolutely not. And we noticed this in the early days of the war, where the objectives and the strategies may have diverged and conflicted. They might be unified in a unilateral alliance in targeting Iran, and definitely not allowing the US to consult with its GCC allies in the region. However, it seems like the fundamental differences in the approach, where Trump is interested perhaps in a regime change, which opens the door and opens a leeway for the US to recognize factors or factions within the existing regime in Iran today, whereas Israel is mostly interested in defeating the regime as it is, and in a much more format or form of a state destruction within Iran. They might be unified in some of the military attacks and in coordination in most of them, but it seems like there are some differences, particularly when it comes to the attack on the energy infrastructure. Now, whether the Trump's administration was aware of it or claims to not be aware of it indicates two major things. One, it doesn't want to face an international and a European accountability in allowing to include the energy infrastructure in the conflict. It also does not want to even further deepen the mistrust that US has created for itself as an ally to these GCC states.
Hamid, let's talk about...
There's a very strong realization that it's the GCC's fundamental strategic ally when it comes to international relations, economically and politically, which is the United States in this case, has prioritized Israel's objectives in this conflict, despite the divergences and differences in some aspects of it, meaning that they have even sacrificed the rationale of the existence of the US bases in the region for the sake of whatever rationale was put, and that was enough to convince the Trump administration to conduct this war. But simultaneously, the GCC is also in a very delicate position where, one, it is also trying to ensure that it is not associated with the Israeli-US strikes against Iran. But at the same time, it's also faced by direct targeting by Iranian attacks through the rationale of the Iranian regime's rationale that it's defending itself, although most of the attacks are directed towards the GCC states. Most of the attacks are directed towards the civilian infrastructure, and now it included the energy infrastructure, which doesn't only harm the economy of Iran, but the region and the rest of the world, which translate into that Iran is not only viewing Israel as a direct threat here, and not only viewing the US base's existence in the GCC as a threat, it's also viewing the national security and the existentialism of the GCC as a threat as well, which compares the expansionist agendas of both Israel and Iran, but in a very different way.
Zeidon Alkinani and Hamid Rissa call himself